program today is a good one, and I'm looking forward to it, Dennis. We appreciate your being here. I've made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way of saying thank you for speaking to us today. As we welcome him to the podium, I want you to remind you that we will have a couple of people, Mary Ellen O'Brien and Deb Raup, circulating microphones to a raise of hands afterward if there's time for questions. The industrial psychologists and sociologists argue that conflict between workers and employers is inherent in medium to large corporations. And in Wisconsin, responses have varied from bold attempts to create ideal working and living conditions to violent confrontations between workers on the one hand and both private and public militias on the other. The question is, can we avoid such conflict, or must we accept conflict and thus management of it as inevitable? A UW professor, Dennis Dresang, will talk about these and other critical questions. He's a professor emeritus of public affairs and political science and founding director of the La Follette School of Public Affairs. His research focuses on state politics, public personnel management, and community issues. He has contributed to public service in a variety of ways, directing a research and public service seminar at La Follette School, students examining community health issues and youth violence, chairing 2 major gubernatorial task forces, and serving on numerous tribal and local governmental commissions on human resource management issues. He was also research director for a policy initiative of Wisconsin's lieutenant governor to improve the status of women, and he was director of the Center for Wisconsin State, Local, and Tribal Governance during its operation from 1993 until 2008. And Professor Dresang serves as a volunteer instructor in a university program for senior citizens as well. Among the articles and books he has written are Politics and Policy in American States and Communities, now in its 7th printing, and Public Personnel Management and Public Policy in its 5th edition. He earned his doctorate in political science at the University of California, Los Angeles, and we're pleased to have you here today.
Well, thanks very much. Gee, a lot of familiar faces out there. Nonetheless, I'm thankful to be here and look forward to our discussion. Okay. There we go. Okay, yes, as was sort of summarized, one of the concerns that one deals with in terms of looking at labor and looking at manager, employers, and society generally is this idea of conflict. And what I'd like to do is talk about Wisconsin, which I think many of you know has been very innovative in a variety of ways, been a national model in many ways. And I'd like to sort of lay out the background and get to questions and comments and wisecracks as quickly as possible. The conflict that I'm thinking about here is, on the one hand, and this is where the industrial psychologists and sociologists come in, people like Ralph Dahrendorf and the like, who talk about organizations and in an organization, in a business, as much as we would like to not have that be the case, there is conflict between employer and workers, between management and workers. That's just a fact of life, they would say. It also is a fact of our social life more generally, speaking of society generally, where we've had a lot of conflict between rich and poor, between people who own businesses and people who don't own businesses. It is political sometimes in nature, sometimes dealing with the electoral politics, sometimes dealing with interest group politics. And the responses, and we see these responses in Wisconsin history, and I'll get into more detail as we go through, have been quite varied. On the one hand, we have a model that was pursued for a while, of having a company town, an ideal place for workers to live and work. And Kohler is the prime example in Wisconsin and actually around the country We see a lot of these in the old company towns, the mining towns out in the western part of the United States. Another response has been to basically say, look, we are not going to have collective bargaining. If you as a worker want to deal with me as a manager or as an employer, it's going to be on a one-on-one basis. That's the rules of the game here. A lot of current management approaches, total quality management, continuous improvement, a lot of us are familiar with that. It goes by a variety of names, include participatory management, bringing the employees in to talk about their work, about their interaction with customers and the like as a way of informing managerial practices and how the company operates. We do have collective bargaining. That's another model. It's a model that is increasingly followed by a minority of organizations and a minority of employers. Workers have been involved politically. Not a big surprise. A lot of other groups in our society get involved politically. And that's been sometimes through political parties, and it's also been through protest movements, getting on the street and making a point, sometimes very narrow incident, but a general point beyond it, the kind of thing that we're, for example, seeing in Chicago today. And we have a variety of public policies. Some of the public policies that have been pursued in terms of dealing with the labor issues have focused on working conditions. 8-hour day is a classic one. Safety in the workplace. Health and a recent kind of set of issues deal with environmental issues that are specific to a workplace and the health issues there. And then there are also public policies that are more process-oriented, dealing with workers' rights and how do we deal with this inherent management. Now, with those kind of models generally in mind, let's talk a bit more specifically about Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, even before we became a state, as everybody knows, I know this is not trivia, you think about it every day, 1848. Well, the year before, we had our first union got started, and it was in Milwaukee, the bricklayers. When we became a state, we had our first strike, and the carpenters, again in Milwaukee, called the first strike. And in 1886, we had one of the first sort of major incidents of violence that deals with this conflict, and that was the Bayview. Those of you familiar with Milwaukee, it's a neighborhood in Milwaukee, the Bayview rolling mill strike. What happened there was that the Milwaukee Common Council, or City Council, had passed an ordinance saying that employers must provide an 8-hour workday for employees in the city of Milwaukee. Most of the employers complied, but not everybody did. And in protesting the employers who were not complying, 15,000 people demonstrated. 15,000 people, that's a lot of people demonstrating in any case, but Milwaukee was a much smaller community then, so this is a pretty large demonstration. Governor Jeremiah Rusk responded by mobilizing the state militia, and the state militia fired upon the demonstrators, killing 7 and wounding almost 300 others. It ended the demonstrations, and it also put a real bucket of cold water on the whole idea of an 8-hour workday for decades to come. It really literally had a chilling kind of effect. That's still in the background. 1893, we have the formation of the Wisconsin Federation of Labor, and their agenda as they formed included a number of public policies. Some of them are ones that today we just kind of take for granted. Child labor was an issue. Workplace safety, having an 8-hour day, that continued to be an issue. Workers' compensation for people who get injured on the job through no fault of their own. Company stores. We could have had a sing-along with a Johnny Cash song, right? You know, I owe my soul to the company store. So that was a big issue that they were concerned about. And getting paid in cash. A lot of employers were not paying their employees in cash, and they, by the way, were not paying them with stock. They were paying them with vouchers or with whatever it is that the company produced. There was another key strike issue, oops, sorry for my little, and that was in Oshkosh in 1898. Here we had, there were 7 of the mills in the Fox Valley area were on strike. It involved about 2,000 workers. And the response to the strike was to charge 3 union members with conspiracy. That is, conspiracy to deprive employers of their right to operate their business and operate it as they wanted. It was regarded as a property right. And none other than Clarence Darrow, a very famous figure in U.S. history generally, very colorful lawyer, one of the most famous of our lawyers, actually came into Oshkosh, defended the people, the union workers who were being charged with conspiracy, and successfully defended them, thus establishing not only in Wisconsin, but in the country as a whole, the principle that a union worker could not be charged with conspiracy. Now that kind of was put aside a bit, and the historical reminder about the House Un-American Activities Committee is a reminder that one of the things that happened during that time too was a lot of what was referred to as red baiting when unions were being organized and union workers were being referred to as communists. The Progressive era, very important period for Wisconsin history and the country generally, an era where we indeed become a model for the country. It gets started with none other than Bob La Follette, or as some people would mispronounce the name, Lafayette. Those are people from Illinois, I guess. Anyhow, Bob La Follette in 1891 began an effort to become governor of the state of Wisconsin. His initial, Bob La Follette, when he first got into politics and became a member of the House of Representatives, was actually a member of the machine that controlled Wisconsin. And this was a machine like, I mean, we use the term to refer to machine as a place where you've got machine bosses that control who gets to run for office, who gets jobs in government. In the case of Wisconsin, the machine was controlled by a triumvirate of Sawyer, Payne, and Spooner, who not only controlled government and who got on the ballot, but also they controlled the economy. One was very much in charge of the railroad, another with banking, and a number was into lumber and with mass transit, the trolley systems that existed in Milwaukee and Madison and Oshkosh and places like that. And they had a little bit of a spat with Bob La Follette because they asked him to bribe his brother-in-law, who was a judge in Appleton dealing with a railroad case. And when Bob La Follette basically said, you could take that money and put it where the sun doesn't shine, he was not dumb. He figured out that they were not going to let him be the candidate for the Republican Party, which was the machine party at the time, for governor. So he had to defeat the machine if he wanted to become governor, rather than continue to work in the machine. And he did so, campaigned very hard, a lot of it face-to-face. And this was going on actually in a number of other states. Think of Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt and the progressive movement in Oregon and Iowa and Michigan. A major distinction between the efforts to destroy machines there, which is the essence of the progressive movement, and what La Follette did here was that La Follette had an agenda, a policy agenda as well. And that agenda included, it was wider than this, included having a civil service, that was mainly seen as a process issue. You couldn't get because of political patronage, and you couldn't be fired. Another part of civil service, couldn't be fired because of your political party connections. Also, there were scandals at the time that involved businesses, particularly businesses in Janesville, Madison, and Appleton, where they had equipment that was not safe and workers were getting injured on the job, and it was sort of, people would shrug their shoulders and say, gee, that's too bad, but that's your risk of working for us. So I wanted to get workers' compensation as a response. And this was a period where there was a depression, as you may recall from your history. As the turn of the 20th century, there was a big depression, and so a lot of people were out of work and poor and desperate. So that became a part of La Follette's agenda. When he became governor, one of the things that he did was he worked with a member of the faculty, a relatively new member of the faculty, John R. Commons. Commons sort of responded to La Follette's agenda by saying, well, here's some ideas. Commons himself was very interested in a number of worker issues. And his approach, which set up the model for these particular programs, was in a sense not really very revolutionary. You know, he could have basically said, gee, we ought to have a general tax, we ought to have a general program to take care of people who are injured on the job. We should, have a more socialistic approach, if you will, for people when they're out of work and unemployed. But instead, he said, no, let's work with employers. Let's work with employers, and what we'll do is set up a system where we will not include all employers under, in the first case, the issue of workers' compensation. We'll just include some, and that's still true today. And what we will do is have employers pay into a fund based upon the injuries that they have. That will be fair, and it'll be an incentive for them to make sure that they have a safe workplace. We'll have a separate fund for each employer, and we'll maintain it, and we will then administer it. So it'll be somewhat like an insurance program, if you will. He also proposed setting up some system to administer the program, and in doing that, actually, very clear in the mind of a lot of people was the issue of not repeating that Bayview rolling mills strike, where you pass a law, you have a policy, and then you don't have employers following it, and that just causes more conflict having to do with non-compliance. The unemployment insurance program, very similar, used the same kind of model. It doesn't really include all employers. We've extended it over the years to include more and more employers, but it still doesn't include all employers. Also having some incentives on preventing unemployment because you would have people paying into the fund based upon their history of laying people off, rather than having it as a flat tax or everybody pays the same kind of thing. The bills weren't immediately passed. It took a while. And by the time that the bills passed, actually, La Follette himself was not governor. He was a U.S. senator. And it's important to note that these were not only sort of innovations in Wisconsin, but they became innovations for the country. A lot of the people in Wisconsin, including Commons, who were involved in authoring the legislation here, actually went to Washington, D.C. and became part of a brain trust, if you will, for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the programs then became national. And frankly, Wisconsin did a certain amount of delaying implementation because of that old concern of, well, if we do this here and we're competing for businesses that might go to Illinois or some godforsaken place like Iowa. I mean, yeah. We don't want to deal with that, so let's see if we can make it national, and it's not an issue of states competing with one another in that way. Another whole issue, not having to do with workers and their health and safety and unemployment compensation kind of thing, is the issue of the right to bargain collectively. And here, Wisconsin's contribution, in a way, is perhaps you might regard it as a negative kind of contribution in that it was sparked by conflict with the Kohler company. As I mentioned, the Kohler, as a community, and the Kohler company really is noted for trying to create an ideal community as well as an ideal workplace for workers. Give them everything they want. It's they're going to be living in paradise. And that's how Kohler was established, again, both as a community as well as a company. Well, workers regarded that as, frankly, being a bit more paternalistic than they could stomach. And they didn't like the controls and the limits that went along with this whole kind of model of the perfect community. So in their minds, it wasn't perfect. And there was a strike in 1934 in which, again, we had as a response to that strike violence. As soon as the strike occurred, Kohler Company hired a lot of replacement workers. That's a fairly standard response. But in addition, they also hired a 400-person private army or security guard kind of thing. And they were armed. And they fired on the strikers, killing 2 people and injuring 43. Not a lot of blood loss, but that's not the point, right? If you're there, if you're concerned, if you're following events, you're just appalled that people would be killed or injured by a private police force. The National Labor Relations Board had a ruling that was brought to them regarding the Kohler company and the Kohler strike that essentially said, look, you must allow collective bargaining to take place. If workers want to unionize, they have the right to do that, and you have an obligation to sit down at the bargaining table and bargain in good faith with them. The Supreme Court, however, said, well, wait a second, this is part of a bill that we regard as unconstitutional. As you may recall, during the New Deal, one of the things that happened was that there were a number of bills that were passed by the Congress and at Franklin Roosevelt's request that were really too broad and gave administrative agencies too much power, too much discretionary power. And the National Industrial Recovery Act was one of them. And there's a clause in the National Industrial Recovery Act that said that people have a right to bargain collectively. So the whole bill was tossed out, including that. And that happened 1 year, and then the next year, 1935, Congress responded by saying, okay, here's a narrower bill. It's the Wagner Act, and it's the Wagner Act then that sets up the law that we currently have at the federal level that says that individuals have the right to bargain collectively, and employers have the obligation to recognize that right to organize and then an obligation to bargain in good faith. That applies, by the way, and importantly, to the private sector. The Wagner Act and the bills that I'm referring to had nothing to do with the public sector. Kohler Company had another strike, the longest strike in United States history, and that is the strike that occurred from 1954 to 1960. And as I think we're all aware, they currently have a strike that they're dealing with. Now, another approach to dealing with employees and dealing with labor workforces is what is often referred to as participatory management. And there are a number of different forms of this. A form that those of us in Madison and those of us in Wisconsin are real familiar with is the one that was authored by Deming. Deming was an engineer. He played a key role in Japan as in the aftermath of the Second World War, as Japan was trying to revive its economy, rebuild its economy. Deming was one of the key figures that went there and did all sorts of pioneering things with Toyota and, I mean, just you name it, all the major Japanese companies. And so he's an American, first did the work in Japan. Everybody started saying, whoa, look at this Japanese economy and the way these businesses are operating. Let's see if we can't get Deming to come here. And in Wisconsin and Madison, it became a national thing. It is national. In fact, it's now international. You see a lot of this in Europe. And as I say, it's called total quality management, continuous improvement. I mean, a lot of different titles for it. But one of the key things is that it includes a process for workers to be consulted on a regular kind of basis about what are you doing, exactly what is the process, are there ways that we can improve it? You tell me. And you get buy-in, you get better information, it works really well. Initially, unions thought of this as a real major threat, and unions did not want to have anything to do with participatory management. There still are some that take that, but most of the time, we're really talking about two separate issues, whether or not there's a union and whether or not there is some form of this participatory management. Let's turn to the public sector. As I mentioned, one of the issues in the public sector had been that if you wanted a job in the public sector, you essentially had to have a letter of recommendation from a precinct captain for a political machine that confirmed that you had worked for a particular candidate. Jobs were available on a patronage kind of basis. It was not at all illegal or inappropriate to say, okay, what political party are you a member of, or do you support, or have you worked for? And that would be a qualification for getting a job. What civil service basically does is it says that that's illegal. And firing people on the basis of their political activity is illegal. That, by the way, is something that has now been incorporated as a constitutional issue based on the First Amendment by a couple of United States Supreme Court rulings. So to some extent, that particular critical element of civil service is really, it's redundant to, in a sense, a better basis, not a statutory basis, but the United States Constitution. Wisconsin was one of the first, along with Massachusetts, believe it or not, a state known for patronage even today, as one of the first states to have a civil service system. So we were a leader in that kind of a regard. We were the first state in the country to say that public employees at the local government level and at the state government level could bargain collectively. There had been a number of attempts, Boston and a number of places where they had tried to unionize, and if people wanted to let them do it, they did, but usually there was a lot of resistance. But in Wisconsin, we had a law that essentially said that if the employees want to, they can organize, and that the public employers, school board, a city, a county, the state has to recognize that and has to bargain in good faith with that. An interesting part of all this dynamic that not many people are aware of is that that particular law was actually at the initiative of personnel managers, not of union organizers. And the main reason was, their argument before the legislature was to say, look, we have to deal all the time with coming up with rules on who gets vacation time, how much vacation time, what does seniority really mean, how do we have work assignments. We're dealing with the prison, for example. Can you put somebody up in the tower, the most despised job by prison guards, and just keep them in the tower their whole career? Or after a certain time, can they transfer out? Do they have the right to transfer? Is it up? And they're saying, you know, we've got, so it wasn't a wage issue. It was more just rules of the game. You know, how do we operate on a daily basis? How do we make all these decisions? And they were, the argument of the personnel managers was to say, you know, it'd be far better if what we would do is we'd sit down with the employees and we'd say, okay, what are the rules of the game going to be? And we might want to revisit this after a while, so let's have a contract. And we can even put in the contract an endpoint at which we will renegotiate the contract. How about that? And that was really the basic argument. I mean, it was sort of like, duh. But like I say, the initiative was really, it was not because of wages, it was more for working conditions and all these rules of the game. Unions then kind of took off. AFSCME, the major public employee union for state and local employees, had its birth here in Madison. Teachers unionized. And in 1974, we had, and those of us who are mature enough to remember this, some would say old enough, remember, and I grew up in the Fox Valley area, so the Hortonville teachers strike is very vivid still in my memory, as it is in the memory of a lot of people in Hortonville in particular. Teachers went on strike. It was very, very emotional, particularly when the school board fired the teachers who went on strike and the teachers who were organizing in the union. The United States Supreme Court eventually dealt with the issue as to whether or not the school board could fire the teachers. Now, mind you, the teachers were striking, and we did have a state law that said you could unionize, but you can't strike. So public employees cannot strike in accordance with Wisconsin law. And so what was being tested was this whole law and the idea that the Board of Education in Hortonville had fired teachers just because they were engaged in labor activities, albeit it was a strike. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court did take up the case, and they did rule that if a state says you can't strike, you can't strike. And if the school board wants to fire you for striking, the school board has the right to fire you. The year after, that case was in 1976. That's when the ruling was. The year after that, the Wisconsin State Legislature and governor passed a law, often referred to as the Meade-Arb Law, which made it pretty unlikely that you'd have the dynamics to have a strike by public employee unions in Wisconsin. And indeed, it has pretty much worked out that way. Essentially, I don't want to get into all the details, but on the one hand, it's got a situation where if you have impasse, the person who's a mediator can say, okay, you're not making any headway. I'm going to take my mediator hat off and put on an arbitrator. Give me one last best offer, entire package, and I'm going to choose one or the other. So there's an incentive to be somewhat reasonable. Otherwise, if you have an unreasonable part of it, the whole thing gets tossed out. So that was one of the dynamics. But the other is that the arbitrator was given certain kinds of things that they were supposed to look at when they made their decision as to which last best offer to take. And there's been, on the one hand, there were unions and particularly school boards would play games with this. And they, in some cases, they'd say, oh, you know, it takes a lot of time and effort to go through and do all this bargaining and hassling and stuff. And so let's just declare impasse. And we'll get a mediator arbitrator to come in here and do it for us. So there was a lot of that was going on. Well, that wasn't really the intent of the law. And it ended up with people not being real happy with the results of that all the time. There were issues about whether or not you could include comparables. You know, does the arbitrator look at what other school boards are paying teachers? Is that a way for swinging one way or another? And there's been some tweaking over the years of this meet-arb law to make it work a bit better. The one thing that one can say is that we really, having a strike by teachers or other local government or state employees is pretty rare. It used to be pretty common, but we really, that seems to be part of our past more than our present. Not necessarily a permanent part of our past, but we'll see. Then there's the famous or infamous Act 10, passed in 2011, that I think most of us are familiar with on the details there. The main issue of Act 10 is that it narrows the scope of bargaining. It doesn't include the stuff that collective bargaining was initially put in place for. All these rules of the game, the work rules, you know, how do you figure out who gets vacation time? How do you figure out who gets what kind of assignment? What kind of transfer rights are there? Can't bargain on that anymore. Can only bargain on wages up to the rate of inflation. So it's a very, very narrow scope of bargaining that's allowed. And another key part of the Act 10 is that it puts a major, major burden on employees to get recertified, you know, so that you can, on unions. So the unions can exist, but to get recertified, to continue to exist, to continue to have robust membership is a super major challenge. We have currently some proposals dealing with civil service that would change the essence of the civil service system from what it's been. A lot of it based on misunderstandings of what's going on right now in the first place. So, where do we end up with all this? You know, where does Wisconsin now? What kind of a model are we presenting? I think there's still a lot to the issue of conflict, and conflict being inherent, that conflict is something that's part of the scene. And as we deal with thinking about, well, okay, if we have conflict, if we are going to have conflict, how are we going to deal with it? I think that one thing we can say is that it's really we've dealt with it in Wisconsin, and we will deal with it in Wisconsin, a really broad set of ways. It's much broader than collective bargaining, which is what most people immediately think of. And just to put it in perspective, today the private sector in Wisconsin is unionized 7%. 7% of the private sector workforce is working under union contracts. In the public sector, and don't have the most recent figures, but a year ago, it was 36% of the public sector, and most projections are that it has gone down by another third. After Act 10, union membership went way down, and in the last 12 months, it looks like it's gone down by another third. So we're really talking, in terms of collective bargaining, it's really covering a very, very small part. Now, you know, a lot of people will follow what unionized businesses do, but we can't exaggerate that. Public policies, I think, will continue to be a focus of attention. They always have been, before, during, and after unions, where labor is an interest group, and it lobbies and goes to legislatures and governors and says, you know, here's a public policy that really needs to be pursued. And frankly, it's also part of partisan politics. There's an argument that Act 10 was more about partisan politics than it was about budgets or anything else. The governor did not campaign initially on Act 10. He never said that he was going to reduce the scope of bargaining and do what he did to the unions right after he took office. The governor never sat down to bargain with the unions. who said that they were willing to reduce the pension and health care benefits that they were receiving. So why did he pursue it? Well, the unions have been very stalwart supporters of the Democratic Party. You know, if you're looking at it from the political rationale, hey, you know, why not? If you're going to be supporting the political party that's not on my side, why should I continue to work with you in ways that might make you healthy and happy? So I think that that argument has to be taken with some seriousness. I think that you know, if we're looking to the future, I think the arenas and the forms of conflict are likely to continue to be quite varied. It's not just going to be unions. It's not just going to be politics. It's going to be within certain workplaces, and it's going to be broader, and it's going to be quite varied. And whether or not Wisconsin will again be a model in certain areas, that remains to be seen. Happy Thanksgiving. So I guess we got time for a couple questions or wisecracks. Yes.
I had a question. Right now, we have the biggest gap between the so-called wealthy and middle class. And the question comes in that is there a relationship between the failure of unions to negotiate minimum wage or wages has an impact on this gap? And let's say, if you look at 60 years ago, the way unions were very strong, unions were very strong in terms of getting minimum wage and increasing the union benefits. What do you think about unions' impact on wages?
Well, unions typically will not be negotiating minimum wages, although in California we do see a situation where food service workers, restaurant workers are now in the process of unionizing with that in mind and trying to deal with the whole issue of minimum wage and tips and how do we deal with that kind of compensation for them. But that's an unusual kind of situation. Unions are only going to be a factor in doing something about the minimum wage in that they join with others in a politically effective way. They're not going to be doing it through the negotiating table. And so this really speaks more to, and this has been true, by the way, historically, of establishing the whole idea of a minimum wage in the first place, of times when we've increased the minimum wage, either at the federal or at the state level. It's really been more of labor more generally, not unions specifically, but labor more generally. I think that right now, in the partisan kind of situation that we're faced with, it's you've got some Democrats who are really taking the lead in trying to promote minimum wage. I know that they would love to have the support of unions, but that's a minor. That's only a minor arrow that they've got in their quiver. So important, but not really all that critical. The politics is more important.
See you here next week.